It was probably around January 2015, so shortly after GraphQL had been announced, and I was kind of playing with an initial implementation of it. And I realized that I could pull data out of GitHub and Stripe and whatnot if I wrote a thin layer on top of them to translate their API into a GraphQL API. I had this ability to express all of my data in a single query across these different services. It seemed incredibly powerful. At the time, I was actually dealing with the Salesforce API, and Salesforce has a number of different APIs. Most of them will have the same data, but the way you access them is radically different. And what I wanted was a way to describe at a high level what data I wanted from these different services and just kind of have this execution engine figure out the fastest and cheapest way to get it to me. And GraphQL seemed to be exactly that. And it was kind of one of these moments where you're chipping away at this brick wall with a spoon, and then someone says, like, here is a bulldozer. Like, you can just like knock this thing right down. I'm Sean Grove. I'm a founder of OneGraph, and OneGraph is a single API endpoint through which you can get all of the internet's data. So around probably 2014, I was actually building a product inside of Gmail that pulled in all the data on your customer from Stripe and Zendesk and MailChimp and whatnot. And we built about 20 different integrations. Each one was kind of bespoke, and there was a ton of work to kind of correlate the data across all these different services. And so around 2015 was when Facebook announced this GraphQL thing. And it looked like the exact way that I wanted to be able to represent all of the data relationships that I had out there in the real world. So it was a perfect match for the kind of product that we were trying to build. So I think fundamentally, the kinds of tooling that you can get from GraphQL, from the developer experience to the user experience to the application lifecycle management, are just phenomenal. And if you look at a lot of the products that are out there for developers right now, a lot of them are trying to recover a computer-readable version of the API information, right? Understanding what's inside of an API. And GraphQL makes that a native concept. And because of that, you have this amazing tooling like autocomplete inside of your editors, the ability to see timing for fields at the deep level, while also being able to think very, very high level about your data organization. So I think GraphQL has really kind of sped up our ability to deliver product, as well as to onboard our developers. So part of what makes GraphQL so fun to work with is the amount of help that the computer can offer you. Whenever you're working with an API right now, it's so common that the first thing you do is go and read the documentation. Like, the documents are written for humans by humans. And a lot of that is good and has a place, but oftentimes documents are very hard to keep up to date. They may be inaccurate, and they're kind of dead things. It's really hard to go from a document about an API to actually experimenting and getting some data out of it. And GraphQL makes it so easy, right? The computer can just tell you, here's all of the documentation I have, here's all the data I have. It's very easy to quickly traverse through a graph and start immediately getting data out of it. And so I think the time to initial success with GraphQL makes it just a blast to work with. And then from there, GraphQL handles all of these nitty-gritty details that you really don't want to have to think about in terms of batching together requests, network performance optimization, security, all these kinds of things that are kind of bespoke concerns with REST APIs, in many ways just go away. They're pushed down into the system with GraphQL, and it means that I get to focus on much more interesting problems. The reason that we went with GraphQL kind of from early on was we realized that, so much of the data that we deal with is actually a graph. If you look at like the World Wide Web, it's actually a explicit graph of documents that are connected to each other. And because of this explicit nature, the computer is able to traverse these web pages, and you get things like Google, which are massively valuable for humanity. There are explicit graphs for, social connections between people, right? Things like Facebook and LinkedIn. And because of that graph, making it explicit and traversable by the computer, we get so much value out of it. And it was kind of crazy to think that we actually have no explicit graph for all of the world's data on the internet in terms of my Stripe data and my GitHub data and my Salesforce data, my Marketo data. Every integration is bespoke. And if you think about it, each of these has an implicit connection across the graph, but as programmers, we have to manually traverse that graph. We have to pull out data from one source, recognize those keys, and then traverse to the other source. And GraphQL offered this really nice way to actually model that graph in an explicit way, such that the computer could help so much more than what we're doing right now. And not only that, but at the same time, GraphQL is able to actually maintain certain performance characteristics that really help with the modeling of large-scale data. And so for us, it was pretty much GraphQL or nothing, right? There wasn't a whole lot of other systems that would allow us to build this kind of large-scale graph while also maintaining any sort of coherent performance characteristics. The performance aspect of GraphQL is that it allows you to really separate the fine-tuning of these queries and gathering the data from the mechanisms, like especially how you get it and what you want to get, are now separated, and that's day and night difference. As far as getting started with GraphQL, I'm kind of split that into two separate concerns. The first one is the set of social concerns, which in many ways are more important than the technical implementation details. Right? You need to be able to sell this to your teammates. You need to make sure that once this actually lands, that people are going to be productive and happy with it. And so I think actually researching and understanding, one, the trade-offs that are inherent with GraphQL, how to design good GraphQL APIs that actually make sense, and having a kind of end-to-end process is going to be important. So I think the first step is just, make sure that you talk to people who understand how this thing actually works, and they can, the GraphQL community is very friendly and welcoming, and there are people who gladly help you design a really nice GraphQL API that's going to make people happy to use it. The other aspect, the technical implementation one, I think is really quite phenomenal for GraphQL insofar as it is designed to be incrementally adopted. You do not have to go all in. And in fact, it's probably a really bad idea to go all in. You're going to be learning and making mistakes, and your API is only going to improve with time. And so starting with these smaller wins means that you can deliver something sooner, you can make people happier sooner, and those mistakes are going to be limited. You're going to be able to iterate more quickly, and then actually you can start to grow that GraphQL API out. And one of the coolest thing is you can build GraphQL APIs on top of your existing REST APIs. And this will give a lot of flexibility to your product teams who actually need to ship product, while not requiring a huge amount of infrastructural changes for your backend team. So it's this beautiful incremental adoption path that means that people can experiment and learn in the small before scaling out into the large.